Coming up on Good Journeys with Second Mountain.
We hold things really tightly. We hold what we believe our reputation to be really tightly. We hold the views of others really tightly. We hold not making mistakes really tightly, or needing to be the expert in things, needing to have all the answers. We hold these things really, really tightly. And in doing that, we invite less people to hold them alongside us, right? Because if you're gripping onto something, well, who else has got room to hold it for us too?
Welcome to Good Journeys with Second Mountain, the show that explores the trails travelled and lessons learned from some truly extraordinary guests. Well, we're here once again for another good journey, and this is a conversation that I'm really looking forward to, but I'm also truthfully a little bit nervous about it as well, as we're going to be covering a topic that I'm pretty sure I do not have any of the answers for. But before we get to that, if this is your first time checking out the Good Journeys with Second Mountain, then I'm your host, Ben Veal, and this show is all about the lessons learned from a host of very special guests. Joining me today, coming up in just a moment, is Sammy Burt, who is going to talk with me all about what it means to be a grown-up. Scary, scary stuff indeed. Now, a quick introduction before we dive into our chat today. Sammy Burt is a speaker, culture change consultant, and now an author too. Sammy is the founder of Backpack and part of the founding team of Farleigh Performance. And Sammy's all about helping people to be the very best that they can be. She spent years helping to develop purpose in brands and loves nothing more than debunking unhelpful myths. She is also a trustee of UK modern slavery charity Unseen. Sammy's now getting set to publish her first book, which is all about what it means to be a grown-up. And it is this that I'm hugely excited and a little nervous to be diving into today. Welcome to the show, Sammy. How are you doing?
I'm really well, thank you. Thank you for having me. What an intro. I'm blushing.
Thank you. And for those not watching on YouTube, I would say that your backdrop is very grown up. That is a grown up setting.
It is a very grown up setting. So yeah, for those not watching, so behind me I've got some sort of mid-century shelving. The less grown up part of that is, or the story behind it is that my partner is a contractor as well as freelancing, and he isn't at the moment, so he's got a little bit obsessed with mid-century teak sort of ladder racks and G-plan furniture. So we have a garage full of sort of 1950s tables at the moment. So while it may look very grown up, it may not be coming from the most grown up of places.
No, so good. I think G-plan. I love G-plan. It's like we've regressed, isn't it, into
absolutely
what our parents or even our grandparents loved before we came along.
Well, and that's what's wonderful about it, is that both of our parents hate it because it reminds them of their parents. So it's like skipping a generation. It's like flares, I guess.
Oh, yeah.
I'm of the generation of skinny jeans, and my parents were the flares generation, and they're loving that. The baggy trousers are coming back in.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think it skips a generation.
Well, look, I want to dive straight into this book that you've got coming out. So it's going to be called What is a Grown-Up Anyway? And it's all about the perplexing world of adulthood. So where did this idea first come from, Sammy?
I'm not sure of that. I wish there was like a moment. People have those great stories of like, oh, this happened and it shot into my head. And that would be inauthentic of me. I think the truth is I've spent my entire life trying to be a grown-up. Sadly, even when I was very young. So I was washing up in a pub when I was 13, because I just wanted to feel like a grown-up. Grown-ups had jobs, right? And grown-ups earned money and they had responsibilities. And so I did that from a really young age, just tried to sort of throw myself into this grown-up world. I would go out with older boys, and then as I got older men. And my friends tend to be older than me. And I think I had this very small-minded mindset, actually, that that age was a big distinguisher of value and who I should be recognizing in my life, who I should be bringing into my life. I remember as a teenager, people that were only a year older than me, I'd be pretty much writing off. as not being valuable to me, which now just makes me cringe, right? But it was this sort of clamoring all the time, this scraping, trying to be something bigger than I was, thinking that's what it was all about. And I did it for a long time. I went into business, and I wore the shoulder pads and the high heels that I couldn't walk in, and I even tried to drink coffee, which I hate, because coffee sounds so much cooler and more grown up than tea or Ribena. And so I think I walked around for a very long time wearing this persona that I thought a grown up was, and it was exhausting. It was exhausting, and when you're trying to be something that you're not, you're bound to get caught out, right? At some point, that mask is going to slip. And that would happen, and then I'd feel silly and I'd feel undermined, and so I think I just got to a point. Do you know what? If there were a moment, actually, it was probably a night I was working late. I was working in an awesome agency in Bath called The House, and I was working late one night, and one of my then bosses, Graham Massey, said to me, "Oh, there's a video you should definitely watch." And I was like, okay. And I sat there, and must have been the winter. It was dark outside. And I watched Brené Brown's TED Talk on vulnerability. And I sobbed. It was like someone was just looking at me and being like, yeah, you don't need to do all that. Like, you can just be yourself. And it was a really big moment for me to realize that I didn't have to be something that I wasn't. And although that isn't when I first started thinking about this idea of grown-ups, it's definitely when I started thinking about authenticity and imposter syndrome and just the amount of things that we're trying to be that I don't really think we need to be.
Well, I think the thing about being a grown-up is, as you say, it's an idea rather than something that's tangible, isn't it? The whole point of this book and where you're trying to get to is actually, what is this? Because I think my understanding is there's a very clear difference between being an adult and being a grown-up. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. So that was one of the first sort of things that I came to in my research. I've been researching this book, well, all my life, and more consciously for the last sort of 3 years. And I think one of the big learnings or early learnings that I came to is that there is a difference between adult and grown-up, but we conflate and we interchange the two phrases or words. But what I came to initially was that you can define an adult. You can point to what it is to be an adult, whether that's biologically or legally or through a rite of passage. You could say that someone that's had a bat mitzvah is now an adult within their community, and someone that, you are adult enough to drive in the UK at 17. You are biologically adult once you've started puberty or you've finished puberty, whichever way you want to look at it. So there are many, many answers to what is an adult, but there are answers. Whereas a grown-up in the first stages of this research felt like something that lots of people thought there was a clear answer to. And then when you really got even just a tiny bit deeper, it was coming out as something qualities-based, something that we couldn't quite put our finger on. And I liken it to like being delightful. Okay. You can be around someone and you can say, my goodness, they're delightful. Now, could you say what it is about them that, all the ingredients that result in a delightful person? Well, you might be able to point at one or two, but there's usually something there that you can't quite name. Yeah. And I do this with my work in that I'm trying to move away from leadership and into to be leaderful. Actually, again, it's this coming together of a number of ingredients that result in something that you can't really plan for.
Yeah.
And so to be a grown-up felt like it was emerging in a similar space, that actually there was a number of different qualities or environments in which someone maybe pointed to and said, that's what I think a grown-up is. But it's quite difficult to go out and be that. There isn't a tick list.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm turning 40 this year, and
that's very grown up.
That is, in theory, it's very grown up, isn't it? And technically, I'm a dad of two, married for 15 plus years, own a house, run a business. Technically, if you look at the checklist, I am ticking off all the grown up boxes, but I couldn't feel less like a grown up if I tried. I mean, I I spend my life, watching and writing about professional wrestling. I collect, toys in boxes. I watch cartoons. I've got a Spider-Man tattoo. I mean, I couldn't be less of a grown-up if I tried in the conventional sense. But it's really hard to know what grown-up is. Like, at what point, am I ever going to feel grown up? Like, do we reach a point where we actually feel grown up, or are we just old one day?
Oh, that's a good question. And it's an interesting one because in my research, I interviewed some very old people. And I had some people in their 80s tell me they don't feel like a grown up yet. And they loved that, whereas other people might give me that answer through gritted teeth or kind of secretly. Some of the older people were like, no, I'm not a grown up. My dad is proud that he's 18 in his head and has never been any older.
Yeah.
And so it's quite interesting that we get to a point where we stop pretending and actually just embrace who it is we are. But still, grown up has meaning to us at that point. And those older people were saying, I don't want to be one. So it's interesting hearing your reflections there of, I've got this Spider-Man tattoo and I've got these toys and things. There's a great, I'm going to plug a different podcast actually, but there's a great podcast by a guy called Blind Boy, who used to be in the Rubber Bandits.
Okay.
Brilliant band. And he has some very interesting takes on things. But he talks about the infantilization of society. And he talks about the Tom Hanks film, Big. And he just draws some fantastic insights from it. So when he describes this, he talks about what made that film funny to us as kids. It was someone going to the office in trainers, right? I mean, it's absurd.
Yeah.
And now I don't have many shoes that aren't trainers. And I will quite happily turn up to a board meeting, as long as they're clean, in my Vans or, in my other train, whatever they might be. So if a teenager were watching Big now, it may not be as funny, because what was absurd then in the 80s, this idea of trainers and trampolines in the office and bean bags and all this sort of stuff, isn't absurd now. That's the reality of a lot of offices. So it's back to where we started in terms of like flares and G-plan, right? We've kind of leaped over the yuppies of the 90s, and now we're all living what we aspired to be when we saw Big.
Well, does that go hand in hand with this kind of drive for work-life balance? So have we kind of got to a point where we're now like, we are defining those cultures and we're saying, no, I don't want to work in a conventional office. When I go to work, I want it to still be fun, to test my brain, but still be fun. Because that's kind of my mentality. I come into my studio space here. When I got my own place, it was like, I'm going to fill this with all the things that bring me joy. Because I don't ever want this studio to ever feel like work, and for me, work is grey carpet, tiles and spreadsheets, so I work on whatever is the opposite of that kind of creative spectrum. And that's how I've kind of furnished an entire studio for my environment. I wonder if there's an element of that, but actually a lot of us, like when it comes to work, we just don't really want to be grown up. We want to use the skills we acquired on our road to becoming a grown up, as it were, but we don't want to fully lead into to growing up, because I guess with growing up comes mortality, doesn't it? Growing up means we are a step closer to not being here anymore, and none of us want that. So I don't know if it does it go hand in hand with this kind of desire to kind of prolong our youth for as long as we can.
I mean, probably, I would say. I think that we're recognizing that we have greater ownership over the spaces that we're in and the way that we behave in them. I think there is a growing awareness of the research that backs that as well, that says, actually, if we are in a more creative environment, whatever the work that we're doing, or a more aesthetically pleasing environment, we are more likely to be at our best, and therefore we are more likely to perform higher. So you can't get away from the capitalist model, unfortunately, however beautifully we design our spaces. But that's okay too, right? Because if it means that we're at our best and we're enjoying that work and we're performing, and then you overlay that with more purposeful organizations, well, great, we may be, through having mountains on our walls and toys around us in boxes, actually positively impacting our society. And that's just a great, offset, isn't it?
Well, that's conscious capitalism, is what you're talking about right there, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely.
You can't escape the capitalist model, but you can escape what you do with the money's earned and what your business does. And I think that's where this book that you're writing, but also the career that you and I have both forged in terms of building our lives around purpose and bringing out the purpose that exists within cultures and brands. That's where there's that lovely dovetail, isn't there, between the two of us?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's I had no idea what purpose was, until I went to the house and we started having these conversations. And on the one hand, it was entirely new language. I didn't get it. I didn't really understand what we were talking about. And on the other hand, it all seemed really screamingly obvious. It's like, well, of course, why would we create businesses that are going to do any harm in the world? And I think when we first started in the purpose space at the house, we had to go to a middle ground first, which was, yes, we want to work with really purposeful organizations, but this was a very new territory then for a lot of commercial businesses. So what's the middle ground? What are the groups that are doing no harm and would like to be doing a little good? Like, how do we go to them first and kind of migrate across the spectrum? But it was a very new space. But I think it speaks into, again, the environments that we create. So your office being surrounded by stuff that is meaningful to you and that will elicit the best from you will also keep reminding you who you are. Mm-hmm. So when an opportunity presents itself that doesn't fit with your purpose or is counter to your purpose, you're not in a white, stale room in which to just make a decision in your own mind. Actually, you are surrounded by the things that remind you who you are, what you want to stand for. So there's some great organizations doing some fantastic work in work environments. So Interaction in Bath are a really good example, who don't just go in and go, well, let's have that wall pink, let's have that wall blue. They really get under the skin of the brand and the purpose in the organization to say, well, let's create a space in which your unique organization is going to be at its best.
Yeah. Thank you so much for being with us for this inspiring conversation today on the Good Journeys with Second Mountain podcast. We'll return to our guest interview very soon, but I want to just take a few seconds now to thank our partners on the show, Resilient Leaders Elements, and tell you all about the positive change they're making in the world. We live in uncertain times where the only constant is change. Resilience has never mattered more, and it's much more than just a buzzword to the team at RLE. Leadership is about resilience, and RLE are focused on making world-class leadership development available to all, training people worldwide to build the skill sets needed to become resilient leaders. RLE's highly respected Resilient Leaders Development Programme is a bespoke development tool that's perfect for leaders of all levels, and you can sign up right now. So if you want to turbocharge your leadership growth and become more resilient both in the workplace and in your personal life, there's never been a better time to start your journey. Visit resilientleaderselements.com now to find out more.
So we're not off grown up, because I think that is some of these grown up qualities that we're talking about. They just feel very different to the stereotype that we grew up with, of shiny shoes and iron shirts and authoritative figures.
Yeah, well, my view of growing up when I was younger was, my dad would leave the house at 7:30 in the morning in his suit and with his briefcase to go off for his professional job for the next 10 to 11 hours before returning very tired at 6 o'clock in the evening for dinner.
Yeah.
And so my view of what work was that was what I was going through schooling to get one of those jobs where I would be an employee at a desk doing my 9 hours in a very professional setting. And that is what I did for the first 10 years of my career, even in PR, this kind of career where you tell people you do PR and they think it's all parties and lovely stuff, when if it's really not. But I spent the first 10 years in very corporate environments kind of thinking this isn't me. This isn't me. Building my skills, but always thinking I'm wearing cultural armor. I'm coming into this office trying to be something that I'm not. And it was only after, the circumstances of COVID and redundancy during that time where I was finding like I can now build a business that leans into my own cultural values. And through that, in the last few years, I felt I've had the confidence to become less of a grown-up, whilst ironically, at the same time, this is where the grown-up definition is very interesting. I've never had more responsibility than I do at this
Yeah.
moment in time right now.
Yeah.
I manage multiple brands single-handedly. I'm running a limited company single-handedly. Head of a household, all that kind of stuff.
Mm.
And it's a huge weight of responsibility. Yet I feel like by allowing myself to lean into some of the things that were my childhood kind of joy areas,
Mm.
I'm better at all of those things.
Yeah.
But I
Yeah.
still feel, I don't know about you, but I still feel like I'm running to stand still as I've grown up. I feel like I'm never on top of the mountain of expectations and, the things my kids need, and being a husband, being a father, being a son, being a friend, being uh,
Mm.
having my clients needing me. It feels like there's always demands pulling you. And, is that what being a grown up is? Like, is that the difference between being a kid?
I think a lot about being a grown up is about self-regulation, is about recognizing where you are, be it in a a whole life that you've just described, or in a single moment, and recognizing, is this who I want to be? Is this how I want to be? So I relearn that all the time. I think that's the other thing. I don't think you pass through a gateway and then become a grown up. I think there are times at which we use certain qualities, or we draw on certain parts of ourselves, and you look back and you go, oh, I was quite grown up in that moment, actually. I didn't rise to that, or I didn't or I handled that quite well. I had my 5-year-old recently asked if we were going to have another baby, to which I very probably too quickly answered, no, we're definitely not going to have another baby. And he thought for a second, and then he said, does the special hug work anyway? And I think I was a grown up in that moment, because I changed the subject very quickly without giving him any kind of explanation. No, in truth, I probably wasn't. I probably, and at other times I've answered him much better. So, but the environment, or we were in the car, or whatever it might be, and so I wasn't at my best in that moment. Now, no harm was done, but I think there's something about being a grown up where you look at a moment, be it while you're in it or in retrospect, and go, how could I have been differently to be in better connection with the other person, or with the environment, or the context that I'm in. So I think there's a self-awareness that comes with being a grown-up. And therefore it can't be all the time, because we are had by our emotions sometimes.
Well, you shared with me, and this was when we were meeting up before recording this, and ironically,
Yeah.
I was drinking a hot chocolate, which I think says everything about me.
No sprinkles, though.
No
So
sprinkles.
very grown up.
I would have had them if they'd been offered. But you shared a story with me about your children and self-regulation, which really hit home, because for me, I always think about how I'm trying to model, and that's when I always feel like I'm falling short of the mark. Can you kind of reiterate that example you gave to me?
I would love to, except I don't know what you're talking about. Can you give me a hint? Let's play a game.
You were talking. I think it was your oldest child, and you were talking about how they had called you on your behaviour, or how you had responded in a situation.
Oh my goodness, he's always calling me out. He's unfortunately, I've got a very astute young man in my household. So he's regularly calling me out. Was it about the quotation marks?
I think I'm not 100% sure. I can't quite remember.
Oh,
This shows
goodness.
my awful memory.
No,
But
well, I do. So there's lots of times when he's caught me out. At the moment, he's very hot on when I'm being sarcastic.
okay.
Which is what he refers to as sarcasm. And unfortunately, I'm a very enthusiastic person, so I often say things genuinely enthusiastically, and he's like, "Are you being sarcastic?" So I get monitored in that way by him. But I think kids are really great for keeping us honest anyway. And calling us out on stuff, and calling bullshit. When we don't quite mean something, or we're not living something, which is really great, and is frustrating, right? Sometimes in the moment. So we have a no phones at the table rule, and I'm often getting barked at. No phones at the table. midweek dinners when I'm still sort of vaguely working, or I'm WhatsApping a client or something like that. So it's really good to have someone else in your life that's monitoring the person that you want to be as well. And I
Yeah.
think kids are really good for that. So sharing with them the type of mum that I want to be gives me another sort of check and balance. I wish I could remember the example that I told you. I'm so sorry. My
I could
memory.
as well, but this is another part of being a grown up is short-term memory loss.
Absolutely, yeah. And I'm. So, do you know what's really funny? Actually, I own that now. So after having my first, I've got two boys, and after having my first son, I did notice my memory wasn't as good, and I kind of made do. And after having my second son, I really noticed the difference, and I really do own it now. So I will often have a meeting and say to someone, "Can I record this on my dictaphone on my app?" Because in this meeting, I'm going to love everything we talk about, and I'm going to totally feel immersed in what it is we want to go away and do. And then in 2 days' time, when I come to write a program or a design for this, I'm not going to feel the feels anymore. I'm not going to be able to connect back to those. So again, I would say that that's a quality of being a grown up is recognizing who you are and where you're at, and owning that, and inviting people to support you in it. You know, I've never had anyone say to me, well, you should just be able to remember. You know, people go, oh yeah, I struggle with that too, or I have a different struggle in life. So there's a beautiful lightening. And actually, this is what I was going to talk about when you were talking about or it came to mind when you were talking about the responsibilities, you know, the weightiness right now. And I think when we're a grown up in terms of the stereotype that we thought we'd grow into, my view is that what's happening then is we're holding things really tightly. And anyone that's listening to podcasts, I'm like gripping my fists here, right? Like white knuckles. We hold things really tightly. We hold what we believe our reputation to be really tightly. We hold the views of others really tightly. We hold not making mistakes really tightly, or needing to be the expert in things, needing to have all the answers. We hold these things really, really tightly. And in doing that, we invite less people to hold them alongside us, right? Because if you're gripping onto something, well, who else has got room to hold it for us too? But when, through the research that I've done, this description of a grown-up then seems to actually hold things really lightly. And I love that. There's this loosening, actually, when we become more comfortable with who we are, when we mature in our view of ourselves and we loosen up on our ego a little, we take more risks. I mean, I must say about 10 times a day, like, what's the worst that could happen? And it drives my partner crazy because we're always doing stupid stuff. But I really wholeheartedly believe that. And I caught it off my mum, who was just a what's the worst that can happen type person. Because most of the time, the worst that can happen isn't really that bad. And the chances of it happening are quite slim. So there's a kind of opening up, a loosening of your grip, moving from holding things tightly to holding things lightly, seems to be a nice analogy for when we perceive someone to be near us who is grown up. They generally are a bit more curious. They're holding their own need to have a position in the room or to be heard quite lightly. They're inviting people in. They're very inclusive. And so I love that idea of actually you'll know when you were being a grown up for a moment because you probably loosened off a little bit.
Feels like there's a real correlation between being a grown up and being wise. Like
Nice, yeah.
yeah, just kind of I feel like as I get older, I have less need, as you were describing there, to interject myself into conversations and to prove that I know best. I think something that comes with age and experience is recognizing that actually you're not always the most knowledgeable in a room, and that other people have valid opinions. And I think you become better. I hope to become better at listening as the years go by. I'm not sure everyone manages to get through that curve. You only have to look at today's politicians to realise not everyone manages to be a grown up.
There's not a lot of grown ups in the Lords.
There's not a lot of grown ups in global politics, I would say. But I'd like to think that to climb the top of a grown up mountain, if such a thing is ever possible, means that you recognise that actually you are a very small grain of sand on a very big world, and actually the things you do have consequences, but very few things are anywhere near as bad as you might build them up to be in your head.
Yeah, and I think the grain of sand's a nice one, because I think the other thing that that I see when I experience when I'm around someone I might deem to be a grown-up is the holding of polarities, holding two opinions at the same time. So we are both a grain of sand and, a whirlwind. We can be both of those things at the same time. And you only have to look at certain celebrities who, we in our heads we might imagine to need security and all this sort of stuff. And then, of course, they go home to their kids and their kids don't give a shit about what film they were in or whatever. Yeah. Sorry, pardon my language.
Very grown up conversation, this, isn't it?
Yeah, yes. But yeah, so you can be both those things at the same time. And I think that's a tension that is really important to recognize and to hold. And to enjoy that we can both be impactful and being significant. I love going to London because I feel so anonymous in the busyness. I love feeling surrounded by people and utterly anonymous within them. Whereas I go into Bath, and please don't think I think I'm some kind of celebrity, but you generally bump into someone you know.
Yeah, of course.
And so there's something really nice about the anonymity, the grain of sand part of that. And of course, there's something lovely about going somewhere where, people do know you or they want to hear what you think.
Talking about people knowing you, Sammy, I know that imposter syndrome is quite a big part of this journey of writing a book. How has that been for you, and how's that manifested itself?
Well, it pretty much took over the first year, I think, because I thought to begin with that I was writing a book I wasn't really writing a book. I was curating lots of people's opinions. And I was trying desperately not to put my opinions on them, because how dare I, right? How dare I?
So did you feel you didn't have a valid authoritarian stance on this?
No, and that I didn't have a right to have one. I didn't have a right to have a view on this stuff. This is really big stuff. And so that became a real hindrance to have this quite purposeful idea. I want the book to be something that even just one person, obviously I hope there's more, reads it and feels relieved, feels, if I close my eyes and picture the perfect scenario, someone lets out an audible sigh of relief that they don't have to be the thing that's been exhausting them, that they've pretending to be for all this time. That's my ideal. That's the dream that I have for this book, is that it releases people from some of these myths that we go around with. And yet, despite having this really great purpose for the book, this really genuine desire for what I thought it could do, I thought that the only way it could do that is if I just collated and curated all the great research from psychologists and thinkers over the generations into one place, and basically shower a reader in evidence, so that at the end of it they pop out and go, oh cool, I don't have to be that anymore. And so that first year was really hard work, because I was so distant from what I was writing. And then I started working with a writing coach, Alison Waller, who's wonderful. And we started by going for a walk and just talking about this. And then we got back and we sort of started, mucking about with some Post-its. And I was telling her about all this stuff. And then I said, and then at the end, I might sort of say what I think. And I always whispered it. And she was like, well, what do you think? And I told her, some of my ideas about this and some of the ways that I see people interacting in the world, and how I hope we can do that differently. And she was like, oh, so that's your philosophy. And I remember being like, I don't have a philosophy. That's a very big word.
Very grown up word.
Very grown up word, right? Socrates was a philosopher. Sammy Burt is not a philosopher. And I said, no, I've just got some thoughts. And she was like, but you've got some thoughts about how you might live your life and how others might benefit from doing that too. And I was like, yeah. And she's like, so that's a philosophy. And I remember I was just sort of sitting there and me sort of just going, no, I don't think you understand. These are just my ideas. And she kept pushing this. And from there, she really unlocked and gave me permission to recognize that, first of all, this is my book. So I can say what I like.
Absolutely.
Within reason, and that was it's such an obvious thing and was such an eye-opening moment that I can have a view, and actually my view is valid. And as you said in the intro, and it makes me cringe and I love it. I do speaker events, I give talks, and I absolutely love doing that. And of course, I'd be lying if I didn't say there was some ego mixed in there, but not as much as you might think. There's definitely some ego in there, but I really enjoy being with a group of people, and most of my talks through different doors inward are about busting a myth or redefining something that we're all walking around with a sort of stereotype in our hand, whether that's, most of my work is in leadership now and organizational development. So whether that's in that space or this grown up space or what development is, what growth is. And people tell me that they like the way I think about things. And I have to remind myself of that when I have moments of not feeling valid or not feeling like I have a right to that. I have to remind myself of someone that's come up to me after a talk and said, that's really changed the way I think about this or that. Or I gave a talk and someone messaged me afterwards. It was a business talk, but someone messaged me afterwards and said, that conversation about being leaderful has really shifted the way I'm thinking about myself and my 14-year-old. And they're the moments where I go, okay, cool. Like, I don't think I'm some guru, but I'm obviously conveying things or explaining things in a way that is useful. So that's okay. I am allowed to do this. I do have to keep returning to evidence. I
think it's fine to recognise the power in storytelling. I remember when I gave a couple of talks last year talking about redundancy and some below periods of my life and kind of how I worked through that journey. And I had huge imposter syndrome going into that first one, thinking, who am I to give this talk to a room full of people?
Yeah.
And a couple of people came up to me afterwards, people whose opinions I held very dearly, and people I've known for a long time, and were saying, like, that brought me to tears. That really moved me. And I'm still thinking it's just little old me going through what I went through. But I think, we're all trying to make sense of this crazy world that we live in. And there's great power, I think, in being, as you were saying earlier, going back to Brené Brown and how many people that vulnerability talk has touched over the years.
Oh, it's incredible.
There's real power in that. And I do wonder whether, did Socrates suffer from imposter syndrome?
I hope so.
Did you ever think, who am I to have these ideas? It does. It does kind of bring me on to a question that I really want to explore, because, I do wonder whether other generations struggled with this concept of grown-upness and adulthood just as much as we do. Like, did you come away from writing this book and the research you went on and the conversations you had with a sense that kind of all of these generations before us have just been muddling through like we are now, trying to be grown-ups without any kind of guidance manual?
Yes. Well, I don't know how far back we'd go, but like the phrase teenager isn't much older than about 120, 130 years. It didn't really exist. Pre-World War One, you got to sort of 12, 13 years old and you went to work. So you were a man, my son. So this idea of adolescence is actually a fairly new idea generationally, that there is a period in which we are no longer a child and yet we are not yet an adult. But there's research into the way that we talk about the generation that comes ahead of us. And what's really interesting is that the words that most generations use to describe the one that follows them are the same.
Thanks once again for being with us for another inspiring conversation on the Good Journeys pod. At Second Mountain, we firmly believe that resilience lies at the heart of all good journeys. And our friends over at Resilient Leaders Elements are deeply passionate about making world-class leadership development available to all. RLE now has an exciting opportunity for those who share the belief that anyone can be a resilient leader. This is open to anyone who'd value an opportunity to collaborate with like-minded professionals from around the world. Their global Resilient Leaders Elements accreditation programme gives you the chance to help others become more confident in who they are and what they do as a leader. The programme is facilitated by an experienced Resilient Leaders consultant who will guide you through the journey step by step You'll then be welcomed into a worldwide network of like-minded resilient leadership specialists. So if you're passionate about developing resilient leadership in yourself and others, why not consider training to become a Resilient Leaders consultant? Visit resilientleaderselements.com now and find out more.
So the words that I hear a lot at the moment in the work that I do is that millennials or Gen Zs, there's an entitlement, right? This word entitled comes up all the time. Mm-hmm. What's really interesting is then when you go back and you speak to Gen Xers about millennials, they talk about entitlement. When you talk about to boomers about Gen Xers, they talk about entitlement. So there is a recurring theme here that we look at the next generation as wanting more than we had, and that not really being very fair. And we look at the generation before as not being very enlightened and not striving. But that's a repeating cycle. So you look at some of the music that was coming out in the 50s, and of course, we would hear that now and think, well, whatever we might think about it. But the parents of the kids that were listening to Elvis, for instance, that was just noise. Right? So there's this repeating cycle of the thing that's coming ahead of us is scary. The thing that went behind us is boring. And that's happening all the time. So the stereotype of what a grown-up is very tied into exactly as yours is, your dad going off with his briefcase, what we saw of grown-ups when we were a child. What's really interesting, I think, at the moment is where those generations are less clear, where we've got, some people having kids very, very young, and other areas or pockets of societies having them very late. And so you end up with sort of middle ground generations. Now, of course, that would happen generally, but it seems to be more nuanced now. The generations almost seem to be thinner, than the last one was, or the years that we're covering. So that's quite interesting in itself of who we're looking to. And of course, and I certainly am not an expert in this, I'm going to say that up front, but our stereotypes of grown-ups, of course, are riddled with bias and with, I didn't want to get too heavy in this, but with discrimination and, the language that is used or was used historically to minorities was very infantilizing. It spoke down to and it positioned minorities and women as being children. Women can't own land or have her own money or have pockets. For a long time was a thing. Heaven forbid she have pockets. And you see the same sort of childlike language being used with minorities. So this stereotype that we built up was a very male and predominantly white stereotype of what it was to be a grown-up. And so a lot of us can't even strive for that because we can't change those things about ourselves. I mean, we're going back a long way, but those things will still be involved in our biases.
We're kind of going back a long way, but also, I mean, I realized I kind of let slip a term earlier when I was describing my life. And one of the things I said was kind of head of a household because I
did notice that,
which is interesting because I don't in any way view myself as head of a household in terms of kind of my position over my wife or anything like that, but more so that I guess when I was younger, I watched that model of a nuclear household, and for many years my dad went out to work whilst my mum stayed at home and raised the children, looked after the house. Which, having done lots of that myself now, I can say is a hell of a lot harder than writing for a living. But I still, I went into the workplace still with that view that I need to be the one that provides financially for my family. And still to these days, even though we have a very, a very split marriage in terms of our responsibilities and what we contribute, I still feel that huge weight as a man to earn for the household. And be interested to see how the generations, because I still, I guess that I equate that to being grown up. As in it's fine for me having all these toys around my office, but if this doesn't make money, then I'm not doing grown up right.
Yes.
Because ultimately I'm still here to make sure that I'm paying the mortgage and paying the bills and providing for my family. Be interested to see how the generations evolve from there in terms of, because my boys are obviously seeing two parents who co-parent, who split responsibilities equally as much as possible. My wife does far more cooking. I'm really working on that. But they're seeing parents who are genuinely partnering in trying to raise them and genuinely muddling along.
Yeah.
And my hope is that then, the next generation and the generation after that, hopefully what we see is much more balance in that scenario, because that all feeds into this grown-upness thing, doesn't it? Grown-upness linked to capitalism. You talked about big shoulder pads earlier. I mean, we're both raised in the generation where the Thatcher years, where it was all about capitalism above all else.
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
It is going to take a while for this generational shift to come into change, but I think some positive things are happening now.
I think so, and I think Greta Thunberg is a great example of a child doing grown up. The bottle that it must have taken on that first day that she skipped school, and then to stand her ground and know who she was and know who she wanted to be and know what she was fighting for, was something so incredibly grown up, and something that so many adults don't get to in their lives. I think we become quite obsessed with the tick list that you beautifully reeled off earlier, and I'm not immune to that. It's my life too, and of course, as you start to load on these things, the house and the kids and the partner and all the other stuff, your attitude toward risk has to lessen, right? Mm-hmm. So then the idea of striking one day of work a week to go and talk about the climate becomes much less accessible. So I think there's some really interesting stuff happening with younger people who are recognizing both their responsibility to the world, the planet, and recognizing the type of people they want to be much earlier.
And so recognizing the, sorry to jump in, but recognizing the freedom that comes from not having dependence.
Yes.
Because that's the thing, you don't, one of the things with grown-upness is you suddenly, I mean, I feel like I'm in the sandwich generation now, very much so. But there is this wonderful period you have where actually it is all me, myself, and I.
Oh, 27.
Exactly. And
best year.
Not before you had kids.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it was before I met my partner. It was, I was single, I was earning okay. I was definitely in a space where I was starting to know who I was and feeling comfortable and confident in that. And so I was taking risks socially and in my life. I was meeting people. I went on holiday on my own. And it was a fantastic year for just saying yes to things before other things started to become something I needed to consider. So 27 was the best.
That was peak.
Definitely peak. But then there's peak elsewhere. So COVID obviously had awful, it was an awful time for many, many people, and I don't ever want to put that to one side. And what it did for us as a family was allowed us to stop. We were on a hamster wheel of work. We had a 14-month-old son. Nothing was going to stop that hamster wheel for us until the whole world stopped. So for us, in some ways, it was a gift because it forced us to pause and to look at the way that we were living and recognize that it didn't have to be that way. So while, excuse me, well, it was obviously an awful reason for that all to have happened, it was a pause that we weren't going to force upon ourselves.
It's always going to be a time that, when we look back in the history books, we're always going to caveat it like that, because there was the wider society implications and the loss and the damage it did and everything that we know about, which will be documented to death over the decades ahead. But for so many people on an individual mundane basis, it brought about some real genuine change, which could influence generations to come. Like when we look back at the impact that, say, world wars had on society, it'll be really interesting to see what the COVID generation, so our children that lived through us on our laptops, trying desperately to make money and stay connected and stay sane, in this crazy situation whilst also parenting young children,
Mm.
how it ultimately influences them when they
Yeah.
become parents and what they remember. Because I know, my boys will have remembered so much of that time.
Yeah.
My oldest was 6 at the time. So much of the difficulties we had as a family, they'll all be sunken in. He'll remember the dark days and he'll remember the good days. And
Yeah.
as he gets older, he'll look back on that time and he'll learn about the realities of that situation. And much like we do now, when I used to speak to my grandfather, and I was fascinated about Second World War, and I was fascinated about rationing and how they survived and how they lived every day, thinking that they could be bombed. And there's going to come a time when our children become adults and go, how did you like genuinely do that? And our
Mm.
answer will be, we made it up as we went along. We muddled through,
Yeah.
and we tried to do what we could to survive, which I think in a nutshell is being a grown up.
Yes, yeah, and the lightness with it. So the way that you're saying that with a smile, while it was absolutely about survival, there wasn't a lot to grip hold of too tightly. That was taken away from us. So we kind of almost had to wake up every day and go, well, let's see how this goes. I mean, we were lucky in that, our son was much younger, so we didn't have to contend with trying to homeschool or anything like that, which I think did bring a very different edge to things. And so we kind of just had this little bubble that was our house. And I can't cook either, Ben. So my partner does all the cooking. So I would go and work, and he would hang out with our son, and then I'd pop out and we'd have lunch together. And then I'd go back into sort of the back bedroom and try and set up a business, which is what was happening for me at the time.
Me too, yeah.
I got my first client signed off on the Tuesday, and then the Friday hospitality closed down. So that was how my business started, which was very interesting. But what's interesting, so book 2, which I obviously haven't even started writing yet, but really probably centers around, so what is a grown-up organization, which is something weirdly is coming up in a lot of briefs at the moment. So as I said, most of my work is in organizational development and system coaching. And a couple of times lately, we've had people within the sort of briefing early conversations talk about, I just really want to have a more grown-up organization. And what I'm noticing happened during COVID was, understandably to some extent, a lot of leaders at the top took back all the control, right? They gripped hard. They got a really tight grip in organizations because there were some immediate decisions that needed to happen. So it's a bit like wartime prime ministers, right? Mm-hmm. There was a need for someone to be quite assertive and to make decisions and to take responsibility for the outcome of those decisions. But what hasn't happened after that is that grip hasn't loosened as much as it perhaps was pre-COVID. So I'm seeing organizations now with quite parent-child mentalities, which isn't uncommon, but more so organizations who would say to 10 years ago, we used to have a great deal more delegation and autonomy. And for whatever reason, we don't now. We've got, parents at the top, and then we've got this kind of adolescents in leadership and management roles. And they're trying to move back to a more grown-up organization where they share leadership, they share decision making, they invite more people into the conversations. But COVID was so quick that we tightened up really quickly, and loosening up on that is going to take some, because of course, loosening up in an organization at a leadership level takes a reduction in ego again, and it takes a lot of self-awareness, and it takes a lot of trust and a comfort with risk and all the stuff that during COVID wasn't really important. We just had to crack on. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see the next generation come into those organizations, and what we're seeing in recruitment certainly is people just going, well, no. I don't want to be in the office more than 2 days a week. That's not how I want my life to work. So I won't work here.
My eyes have been open to what's possible, and I don't want to ever go back. Why would I go back to 5 days a week in office when I don't need to? And when it's been proven that from a work standpoint, I don't need to do that anymore. I sense another conversation coming up in the future when that book is out, because I'd love to dive more deeply into that. I think that's such a rich area. And I think you and I, as people who have both founded businesses during a pandemic, but who also work with brands to help them around understanding their purpose. I feel like there's a lot we can talk about here, but
Yes.
I want to keep it to book one.
Yes, sorry,
The
I'm
one
getting
that
excited.
the one you have written, not the one you haven't written.
Yeah.
Tell me what you know. The book's out later this year.
Yeah.
Tell me what you hope people are going to take away from this, and what you hope the impact of this book's going to be.
Um, really that audible sigh. Like I so want I so want to come across someone reading that book on the tube or in town or whatever, and for them just to be feeling looser and lighter. And we talked a little bit yesterday about the book and about how I'm publishing it. And there's an ego part of me that would love to have a publisher. And I went out to a load of agents, and they came back, and what was great is I didn't have anyone come back to me and say that is a terrible idea. I did have a lot of radio silence, understandably, but I did get people come back to me and say this is a really great idea, but no one's going to publish it because no one knows who you are. You know, you can't guarantee that you're going to sell 10, 20, 50,000 books. And that was a growing up moment for me. My ego kicked in. Well, what's the point then? And then I went back to the purpose of this, and I thought, well, I'm not doing this to sell loads of books. I'm certainly not doing it to make money. You know, very few writers or authors.
You don't get into writing to make money.
No. So I thought, well, if I'm doing this to try and support people to own what's real for them, then I need to do the same. So even the publishing process that I'm going to go through is a learning process for me. And I'm working with professional editors and I'm working with professionals. I'm investing in this, but I want even the process of launching it to be a story of me loosening up my grip on what I thought writing a book or being an author needed to be, and actually being a lot more realistic with, if you're true to your purpose, there's so many different routes that you can take to achieving it. And now I take a lot of pride in that. I think I'm quite excited about self-publishing and being in control. I do quite like control, and seeing what happens and seeing it, kind of organically get out there, and that's what makes it really, the pressure then is off around number of books sold or any of that sort of stuff. This is so much more about getting a message from someone on LinkedIn just saying, hey, I went into work today in my trainers or whatever it might be. I didn't pretend to know the answer when my boss asked me something yesterday. Or I didn't feel I needed to fit in with the guys at the school gates when I was doing drop off who all had their holidays planned, or whatever their version of it might be. I just really wholeheartedly hope that there's a handful of people out there who just feel lighter because of it.
And this is why I wanted to have you on now, because in the usual kind of book media tour world, we'd be having this conversation at the point that your book published. But I want you on now because I want my audience to follow that journey, Sammy. I want them to follow your stages over the coming months. I know on your website, which you're going to wonderfully give me the URL for in a second. You can you can sign up for the launch news and to be kept updated. So how can everyone listening and watching today keep in touch with you on social and get ready for this book coming out?
This is a really good question, and one I definitely should have had answers ready for in a very grown-up way. So you can find me, I have a page on Facebook for the oldies. So Sammy Burt, author, where I try and sort of document the journey, and a similar handle on Instagram. You can find me there, Sammy Burt, author. And on LinkedIn, I talk about this a lot as well. So Sammy Burt, you can find me there. And my website is yourbackpack.co.uk. And on there is a page called The Grown Up Book, where, as you say, people can get a bit of an idea, see some pictures of me in an oversized suit, which was my my big photo shoot, and register for updates. But as you say, I'm trying to tell the story as I go, the hard bits as well as some of the fun bits.
Yeah, I'm so excited for this coming out, and I'm so
Thank you.
over the coming months, and I will be there following this journey with you. It's such a big deal. It's such a grown up thing to write a book. So even if you're not a grown up in any other way, you can say you're a grown up author very soon.
I will do. I will do.
Thank you so much for your time today, Sammy. It's been an absolute
Thank
pleasure.
you. Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Well, I still don't feel like any more of a grown up, but I'm glad that I'm not the only one. Thank you to everyone for sharing this time with me today. I always finish off with a few thanks. Obviously, thank you to my guest, Sammy Burt. Thanks as always to Jeff Easton from Tall Lake Productions, whose face always pops up here when I say that, for bringing this conversation to life so wonderfully. This show relies on all of you. There's 1,000,001 podcasts out there, so please like, share, comment, leave us a review, and the best thing you can do is go to social media and leave us a comment using the hashtag GoodJourneysPod. So that's it for another episode. I've been Ben Veal. My special guest has been Sammy Burt. This has been Good Journeys with Second Mountain. So until next time, let's keep climbing together, and I'll see you all soon. Bye.